In today's note, we are going to be moving into a new unit called Analytic Geometry, and the first thing we're going to be looking at is midpoint of a line segment. So basically in analytic geometry, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using the concepts that we learned in linear relations or linear equations and apply that to some geometric properties, apply that to line segments, shapes, and whatnot. So in the first note, what we're going to do is try to find the midpoint of a line segment. So we can see on our graph here we have a line segment that goes from -3, 3 to 5, 3. And we want to find the midway, or the midpoint, or the halfway point of this line segment. And looking at it graphically, right, we have it all drawn out. It might be fairly easy to determine what the midpoint is, because I can count how many spaces I have to go from one end to the other. And then I can see that it's 8 spaces. So the midway point should be 4 spaces in or here. And then if I go through, I can actually come up with that point. It's 1, 3. And that might be easy and fine for when we are looking at the actual graph. But if we're not given the points, if we're not given the graph, or maybe it's not on a nice straight line like this, and maybe it's diagonal, maybe it meets somewhere in between some squares or the scales, we want to come up with another way or another method of finding the midpoint. And so we want to look and see, is there any way we could have calculated this without actually counting the number of squares? And basically what we're going to do, if we're trying to find the halfway point, right, we want to find the halfway, or we want to find half the distance between our 2 points. Because it's a midpoint, we're going to be dealing with 2 parts, right, the vertical aspect and the horizontal aspect. So vertically, or the y value, or let's start with horizontally, the x value. So horizontally, I start at -3 and I go to 5. So if I do that, that's my entire distance. And then I'm going to divide it by 2 to find the halfway point, right, or halfway between them. Vertically, even though it's the same value, I can still do the same thing. Right? My 2 endpoints, and then divide by 2. And I'm left with 2 over 2, which is 1, and 6 over 2, which is 3. And there I have my midpoint. So basically what we've done is we've found that the coordinates of the midpoint of a line segment are the averages of the endpoints of the line segment. So if I know my 2 endpoints, my midpoint is just going to be the averages of those endpoints, specifically for the x values and then for the y values. So that's where we can come up with this formula, x1 plus x2 divided by 2 for the x value, and then y1 plus y2 divided by 2 for the y value. And again, just reiterated, so therefore the midpoint given the 2 endpoints is, and basically we just split it up, so to find the x value, you're adding your 2 endpoints, the x values of your endpoints, and dividing by 2. Same thing for the y value, and then those 2 answers are your midpoint. So again, what we've just written down here is just the broken up version of the actual overall formula. So in example 1, find the coordinates of the midpoint of a line segment with endpoints A, which is -9 and 3, and B, 5, 7. So again, we could draw this out, we could create a graph and draw it out, but it may not be a nice straight like flat line or vertical line, so it might be hard to actually count the squares. So let's use our formula. Right? I want to look for my x value for the midpoint, and the x value for the midpoint, if we go back up to our formula, is x1 plus x2 divided by 2. And then the y value for our midpoint is y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So again, these are our 2 formulas. We need to now get our values, right? We need to know what the endpoints are. And we have them. So if I look back at these formulas, I have my x1, y1, and I have my x2, y2. Right? Either it could be switched around either way. It doesn't matter which end is the starting or the beginning, especially when you're adding the values. So let's start with the x values. So x1 is -9 plus x2, which is 5, divided by 2, and we should get -2 as our answer. For the y value, y1 is 3 plus y2, which is 7, divided by 2, and we should get 5. So therefore, the midpoint is, and we just combine these two values, right? The x1 comes first, so -2, 5 is my midpoint. In example 2, one end of a line segment is P, -6, 3, and the midpoint is M, 4, -1. Find the other endpoint Q. So this one's a little different because we're given one endpoint, P, which was -6, 3, straight from the question, and we're told that our midpoint, let's just say it's around here, is 4, -1. And we need to find the coordinates of the other endpoint. So if we know where our halfway point is, we want to find out, okay, what's the other endpoint of that? So we're still going to use the same two formulas that we've dealt with. So our x midpoint and our y midpoint. Right, remember, is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And let's plug in all the information we have, right? So if I look at the x coordinate, or the x coordinate specifically, I know what the midpoint value is. I know that's 4 because I know what my midpoint is. The x1 I know because I know one endpoint, which is -6, plus I don't know the other endpoint, or x2, but that's what I'm trying to find, and I know I have to divide by 2. So here I've plugged in everything I can based on the information that's given to me, and I do have one missing piece, which is this x2. But because this is an equation and I only have one missing variable, I can solve for that x2 value. So I'm going to work on solving it. I'm going to bring the divide by 2 up so it becomes multiplied. So we get 8 equals -6 plus x2. I'm going to move the -6 over so it becomes 8 plus 6 equals x2. And I get 14 equals x2. So that's my endpoint. That's the x value of my endpoint, or of my second point. For the y value, we're going to do the exact same thing. Plug in what we know. Right? I know the y value of the midpoint is -1. I know the first endpoint y value is 3. I don't know y2, and I'm dividing by 2. Same idea. The 2 is going to come up because now we're going to solve. So I'm going to get rid of the fraction by multiplying both sides by 2. So I get -2. And cancel it on the other side. And then 3 plus y2. -2 minus 3 equals y2. -5 equals y2. And so at the end, we can now combine everything. So therefore, point Q, or endpoint Q, is 14, -5. Right? So the x value that we found and the y value that we found. And you can see that based on my line, those values, or the way it's drawn, isn't even close to what the points are. We're just drawing it as a representation to help us understand what we're given. It's okay that it's not, the coordinates aren't in the right spot, but we do know that we have an endpoint, a midpoint, and we're looking for this other endpoint. So it's okay that it's not drawn quite to scale. In example 3 says a circle has a radius with endpoints E, 2, 4 and f -4, -8, find the two possible endpoints for the diameter that contains that radius. And then there's a hint, there are two possible circles. So remember that an endpoint, or the radius, is from the center of the circle to the end or to the edge, and the diameter is the entire thing. So we're basically looking for the other endpoint of the diameter if we know what the radius is. And there's two possible circles for this. Right? So we know what our two endpoints of the radius are. So that means one possibility could be that, say we have F here and E is at the center. Let me just redraw this. So F and E are there. So that means that F here would be -4, -8, and E would be 2, 4. And the other endpoint of our diameter would be over here, which we could call, let's say, just call it G, and would have x2, y2, because it's an endpoint. In our other example, let's say it was the other way around. Let's say F was our center, so -4, -8. And let's say E was our one endpoint, and then G is still an endpoint, but in the other direction. So those are our two possibilities, right? We don't know which way the circle is going to be because we only know of the radius. So either one would technically be correct. So let's go through and let's try to solve, right? So actually, let's use a different, sorry, I'm going to go back and just use a different value. So if that's EFG, let's call this one D. So I'm going to look at the first circle. I want to find my other x value, or my other endpoint. So I'm going to still write out my formulas. xm is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2. I'm going to plug in what I know. Remember, E is the midpoint. Right? So if E is the midpoint, it's xm, ym. This would be x1, y1. So my xm in this case is 2, is equal to -4 plus x2 divided by 2. The 2 comes up to the other side, so we get 4 equals -4 plus x2. And then when we solve this, 8 equals x2. So I found the x value of my one, or of my endpoint. Now I'm going to try to find the y value. So I'm going to use the formula for that. y1 plus y2 divided by 2. I know the y value of the midpoint is 4. I know my y1 is -8, and I don't know my y2. I'm going to divide by 2 as part of the formula. And now I'm going to solve. So I get 8 equals -8 plus y2, and 16 equals y2 when I go through and solve. So therefore, one endpoint is 8, 16. Right? The x value and the y value together as a point. I'm going to try the same thing for the next one. Right, the exact same thing. The only thing is going to be some of my points are going to be a little different. So now I have my x1, y1. I have my midpoint, so xm, ym. And I don't know my x2, y2. So slightly different, but again, same idea. Same steps when I'm going to go through and solve. So I'm going to use my x value midpoint formula. So x1 plus x2 divided by 2. I know the midpoint in this case is -4. x1 is 2 plus x2 divide by 2, and the same steps for solving. So bring the 2 up, it's multiplied, and you get -10 equals x2. So again, if you're getting confused on some of these steps, we're just using the basic concepts of solving equations, right? Moving things to the other side changes the operation, or does the opposite operation. And then we do our ym, so y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Ym, or the y value of my midpoint is -8, is equal to 4 plus y2 divided by 2. Let me move this over a bit. Move this up here. 4 plus y2 divided by 2, so that comes up. -16 equals 4 plus y2, and -20 equals y2. So therefore, the other endpoint is -10, -20. So again, you're just using that idea of the midpoint formula to help you either find the midpoint or to find the other endpoint of a line segment.